Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be discussing RAM and why it's so important for PCs. So let's get right into it. RAM is one of the most important parts of any computer. It stands for random access memory, and it's your computer's short-term memory. It temporarily stores the programs and the data that the CPU is actively using so that they can be accessed extremely quickly. One way to think of RAM is like the desk that you're working at. For example, take your SSD. Your SSD is like a filing cabinet, your storage. It stores everything permanently. But when you're actually working on something, you don't keep opening the filing cabinet every single few seconds. You take the files out and you place them on your desk. RAM is essentially that desk. Now let's take a look at a real life example. Take your operating system, for example. Your operating system is permanently stored on your SSD. So when you boot up your computer, the OS files are copied from the SSD into the RAM. And then the CPU takes those files and executes the instructions stored in the RAM. But this doesn't just happen for your operating system. It happens for web pages, for images, and even videos. They're all stored in RAM. And the more programs that you run, the more of the RAM that gets used up. But what happens when you run out of RAM? Imagine the desk again, but this time imagine that it's completely covered with papers and there's no room left. What do you have to do? You have to take the papers, and some of the papers you have to put back into your filing cabinet. And computers do the exact same thing. When the RAM fills up, the operating system starts using parts of the SSD as a virtual memory. And since SSDs are much slower than RAM, the performance drops significantly. So that's why a computer with too little RAM can still feel a little bit slow even if it has a fast CPU. Now, a question comes, why don't we just use RAM for everything? Why do we even need storage or SSD? Well, it's because RAM is temporary. What does this mean? Well, let's say you have an image of a dog and the image is stored in RAM. Well, if you power off your computer, all of your RAM is going to be cleared. The images are not going to be saved and everything stored in RAM is gone. So that's why RAM is temporary and it's called volatile memory. And that's why we need things like SSDs and hard drives to store actual things we want to keep even when the PC shuts down. There's two things you want to consider when you're purchasing RAM. The first is the capacity. How much RAM do you actually need? Today, common amounts include 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, and 64 gigabytes. And usually you buy two sticks, each with equal amounts. Now, having enough RAM means that your computer can keep more programs and data instantly available without having to constantly swapping your information to the storage. 8 gigabytes is usually for basic use. 16 gigabytes is for gaming and regular work. 32 gigabytes is for content creation and even heavier workloads. And 64 gigabytes is almost 100% of the time overkill, unless if you're doing it for professional applications like 3D modeling. Now, the second thing that you want to consider is your RAM speed. Speed is referred to as DDR or double data rate in RAM. Most modern computers typically use DDR4 or DDR5 memory. DDR5 provides higher bandwidth and faster transfer speeds than DDR4, which basically means that it's allowed to move more data between the RAM
It
and
is
CPU
better.
per each second. For most users, the capacity matters more than the really small differences in speed. But now, why is RAM called random access memory? Random access means that the CPU can access any memory location directly without having to search through everything else first. So, for example, on this RAM stick, you can see that there are these little chips. And these chips are called memory chips, and it's where the actual data is stored. And random access simply means that the CPU can reach the data almost instantly. And this direct access is one of the reasons that RAM is so fast. Okay, so RAM is your computer's short-term memory. It stores programs, files, and data that the CPU actively needs to use, which allows your system to access information much faster than it could from just an SSD. When you have enough RAM, your computer feels very responsive and smooth. And when you don't, the system is forced to rely on slower storage, which causes a lot of slowdowns. And yeah, these are the fundamentals of RAM and why it's so important for your PC. And I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.